Ionic compounds contain ionic bonds, which form from the transfer of electrons from one atom to another. These produce ions. These can either be cations, which means they have a positive charge, or anions, which have a negative charge. Now, the key thing is, for an ionic compound, you have to have both a cation and an anion. These ions can either be monatomic, which means they have one atom, like Na plus or Cl minus or Cr3 plus, or they can be polyatomic. That's when you have two or more atoms forming a molecule, and that molecule has a charge. For instance, ammonium is a nitrogen and 4 hydrogens, NH4, with a positive 1 charge. And the key thing is, when you have these cations and anions coming together, they form a neutral compound. The positive and negative charges must cancel out. So for instance, if I have Na plus and Cl minus, the positive charge of the sodium will cancel out the negative charge of the chlorine and will form a neutral NaCl. Now this becomes more complex for something like Mg2 plus and Cl minus. Magnesium has a 2 positive charge. We can find this from the periodic table. Chlorine has a -1 charge. And so if I just put together a 2 plus charge and a -1 charge, that would get me something that has a positive 1 charge, MgCl plus. So this would not be a neutral compound. And so instead, what has to happen is we need to have twice as much of the chlorine to cancel that out. And to do this, we can use something called the crisscross rule, where we basically take the charge of the Cl minus and move that over, and that's the number of magnesium. And the charge of the magnesium becomes the number of the chlorines needed. And so these will produce MgCl2. And so this happens because we have a +2 charge from the magnesium, and we have 2 times the -1 charge of the chlorine, and so that's going to give us a neutral compound. Let's do some others. Let's say we wanted to know the compound formed from lithium and oxygen. So the first thing we have to do is we need to look at the periodic table. This group here, including lithium, is always +1. The group with oxygen is always -2. So that means I have Li plus and O2 minus. Now, I always start with a cation first on the left-hand side, and then the anion on the right-hand side. And so these are going to form Li2O. This will be the compound formed from lithium and oxygen. How about oxygen and calcium? Well, here's oxygen, again, O2 minus. Calcium is Ca2 plus. So we have O2 minus and Ca2 plus. So if I do the crisscross, I may think that it's Ca2O2, but I actually have to do one trick when I look at ionic compounds. I actually have to simplify. Notice that both these obviously can be divided by 2. And so this becomes CaO. That is my formula for the ionic compound. Let's do oxygen and ammonium. Oxygen, we already said, was O2 minus. Ammonium is NH4 plus. This is one of the polyatomic. You won't find this on the periodic table. You need to know that this is a polyatomic. And so we put the NH4 plus first because we always put the cation first. And we have the O2 minus on the right-hand side. Okay? And then what we do is we do that crisscross rule. And that becomes NH4, 2, O1. Now, notice that this looks like it's NH42. So what we have to do is we need to use parentheses around that NH4 to say that we have 2 NH4 groups, 2 ammoniums, and 1 oxygen. Finally, let's look at one last one. Let's do oxygen and nitrogen. Nitrogen is N3 minus, O is O2 minus. So when we look at this, we may say, Well, these do the crisscross, but notice they're both anions. They're both negative. So that means these will not form an ionic compound. Nitrogen and oxygen, because they don't have a cation and an anion, they do not form an ionic compound. Instead, they will form a covalent compound. And the thing with covalent compounds is that you can have multiple different types of compounds. So for instance, N and O can form NO, or they can form NO2 or N2O. There's no one set compound formed from these, and that's because they form covalent compounds.